In the wake of the 2020 crisis, irreparable damage has been done to the United States economy. The rate of inflation has been on a non-stop rise with no apparent end in sight. A deadly pandemic is sweeping the nation as our government throws all caution to the wind and completely opens up our economy. Supply chain issues are contributing to shortages in stores left and right. The greatest value transfer in history from the bottom to the top is transpiring as we speak, and an ongoing labor shortage is threatening the profit margins of industry. As for some reason or another, the collective of the American working class has just entered a hysterical fever dream, and they just don't want to work. The labor shortage has been the talk across US media for some time now. It's a phenomenon that economists, politicians, journalists, and talking heads alike just can't wrap their heads around. Why is it that firms are struggling to get people to show up to work? The truth is that to characterize this advent as a labor shortage is a complete misrepresentation of what is actually going on. Because to call it a shortage is to imply that there isn't enough available human labor capital to perform the work. On the contrary, it is, and yet liberal news media is talking about this phenomenon as though we have a physical shortage of people in the same manner that a country like India or Pakistan might have a physical shortage of water. A more apt description for what is currently transpiring could actually be called a labor boycott, as people, voluntarily of their own volition, are willingly choosing not to go back to work since in many instances, unemployment pays out more than what these shitty jobs would. Let's apply traditional orthodox economic analysis to this problem. The US adheres strictly to the market, and supposedly, the market handles shortages the best since fluctuations in demand signals a corresponding increase or decrease in price as a rationing mechanism. What typically happens when there is a shortage of goods is that the provider of said goods raise the price, which according to Economics 101 would lead to new competitors cropping up on the market to manufacture the shorted good in question. Suddenly, there's no longer a shortage. Labor performed by humans is not the same as a physical commodity, but the general premise is similar enough. In a capitalist system, both labor and goods are commodities, fluctuating in price according to supply and demand. So this is what orthodox economics suggests is supposed to happen in theory, but what is actually happening in the reality? As of now, in the face of this shortage, despite labor being in demand, there is no shortage of data which demonstrates that wages today are at a historic low. Everybody's familiar with this chart, which showcases that Americans have not seen a meaningful wage increase since 1979, and yet we have a labor shortage? Naturally, this should lead to companies raising wages, right? Since there's demand for labor. Well, yes and no. Many companies are being forced to raise their wages just to get people through the door. McDonald's and Walmart, for example, are starting to advertise their jobs starting pay between $15 to $18 an hour. However, upon further inspection, many workers end up being paid far lower than advertised. Job experience qualifications end up disqualifying many new hires who were told that they would make that much just to get them through the door, and that what they would actually be paid in practice was $10 per hour for the foreseeable future. On the other hand, companies will also pull the good old bait and switch, say that you can earn up to XYZ amount of dollars per hour in incentive, but your actual base pay is going to be substantially lower than that. FedEx, for example, advertises on all of their signs posted by stoplight corners and intersections that they're paying up to $24 per hour for new hires. The key phrase here being up to. They pay $24 to start. That is, if you're working on the weekend, working night shift 50 hours per week. Otherwise, weekday pay is $20 an hour, day shift is $19 an hour, and part-time is $17 an hour, 25 hours per week. And yet they advertise $24 per hour because they know that's what's going to get people through the door. So either you're making enough to pay your bills and live respectively, but you basically have no life outside of work because you're away for 12 hours per day, or you're working 25 hours per week, getting paid well under your own reproduction cost as a worker. Stack on top of that the dangerous work environment, the exhausting back-breaking grunt work, the cancer-inducing overexposure to soot because they don't clean their trailers, and the totalitarian managements which will fire you for daring to listen to music on the job. Speaking from personal experience here. This is the true nature of the labor shortage. Due to a number of compounding economic trends which have been building up for decades, which have gone completely unaddressed for so long, what we are now witnessing today are the chickens coming home to roost. The natural consequences of the needs of the working class being ignored for so long, as well as the degree to which all of the necessities of life have been commodified, pricing most of the population out of the market unless they take on debt, as well as the fact that the middle class has become increasingly downwardly mobile. Come, let us overview these trends which have been building up for some time in detail. With respect to United States gross domestic product, compensation for labor is lower than at any point in the second half of the 20th century. In other words, as a share of aggregate GDP, wages have been declining. On the other hand, corporate profits now make up a growing share of gross domestic product compared to previous decades, so much so that it constitutes a historic high. Keep this fact in mind next time someone tells you that we can't afford a $20 minimum wage. Among the most commonly cited causes of this include, but are not limited to, a massive consolidation of firms and rapidly declining union membership. The remission of unions has coincided with diminished bargaining power on the part of labor. In other words, workers no longer have any organized institutions representing their interests within the firm. As a result, workers aren't able to effectively leverage their labor power against the firm for concessions. This feeds into the gradual fall in real wages, the vanishing pensions, diminished job benefits, and reduced job security. I shall cite excerpts from 3 articles for review. First is an article from USA Today discussing the phenomenon of the vanishing pension, something which has already been transpiring for years long before the pandemic. Quote, nearly 2/3 of pension funds are considering dropping guaranteed benefits to new workers within the next 5 years, according to a human resources consulting firm that studied the matter. Despite gains in the stock market this year, U.S. pension plans are near their worst financial state in 2 years, according to the news report by Mercer, which casts a spotlight on the escalating cost of past promises to employees. Most U.S. companies no longer offer defined benefit pensions, which typically provided guaranteed monthly payments to workers when they retired. But pension funds that still operate must gain in value to ensure that they have enough to meet their obligations. By late 2019, the average pension fund had 85% of the funds necessary to meet its obligations over time due to largely low interest rates, according to Mercer's 2020 Defined Benefits Outlook. The firms also reported that 63% of companies with defined benefits pensions, quote, are considering termination of the plan within half a decade. That would mean that the pensions would be closed off to future participants. The report comes as corporate pensions continue to disappear, unquote. Another article from U.S. News reports on data continuing to verify the trend of diminished benefits. Despite the so-called economic recovery, across the board, employers are only continuing to slice benefits from pensions, to retirees, to health insurance, to long-term care, educational benefits, and so on. The Guardian reports on a study from the economic think tank, the Washington Center for Equitable Growth, which showcases how and why Americans seem to be working more hours than ever before. Quote, the study defines overwork as more than 40 hours per week. It found that those working in higher paid professions were more likely to clock in longer hours. Nearly 30% of management and legal workers reported working 45 hours or more per week, followed by 20% of those working in farming, fishing, and forestry industries. Architects and engineers, and those in business and finance, also indicated that long hours were the norm. The author used data from the Current Population Survey, a monthly survey of American households by the U.S. Bureau of the Census. They analyzed survey results from 2011 to 2014. Limiting their sample to working people between the ages of 16 and 64, and including both hourly and salaried employees. The rationale for this should be obvious. The longer that they can keep people on the job, the more revenue that they can extract from people's labor, and the more that the firm has to pay the workers, the less revenue that there is on the table for private enrichment, and vice versa. Every dollar that the firm has to pay out in benefits, wages, pensions, or vacation time is a dollar out of their pockets. In the endless pursuit of private enrichment, coinciding the falling rate of profit, capitalists are compelled to get more and more out of their workers while paying them less and less. And without the protection from strong unions, this systematic phenomenon only continues to intensify over the years. Stack the supply chain crisis and the endlessly rising costs of living with stagnating wages, diminished benefits, and job security, and you've got yourself a recipe for a long depression with no end in sight. When we think of the 2020 crisis, many people like to treat this happening as though it occurred in a vacuum, as though the global pandemic alone is the cause. The truth is that while it was the coronavirus which triggered the stock panic itself was going to happen sooner or later, one way or another, due to a number of lingering contradictions which have been building upon themselves for decades prior to that. All the virus did was lay bare the weaknesses, shortcomings, and the cruelty inherent to the system. Some of these worsening trends include underemployment and the declining workforce participation rate. The workforce participation rate is defined as the number of able-bodied adults that are active in the workforce. As you can see from the chart on screen, prior to 2008, the workforce participation rate was stable. However, between the years 2008 and 2020, you see it steadily declining. Finally, in early 2020, you see the workforce participation rate plummet to a historic low before rebounding. However, take note here, it never rebounded back to where it was before the crisis. It has permanently stayed below 63.4% since the crash. There are a number of reasons for this. One of them, of course, is the labor boycott itself. Another reason is also because many within our workforce have been reaching retirement age in recent years as well. A third reason, one not so often talked about, is the growth of the reserve army of labor among college-educated adults. Findings from the Economic Policy Institute have shown that since the year 2000, wages for STEM workers have either stagnated or declined. Big companies such as Boeing and IBM continue to lay off thousands of STEM workers every year. In 2013, of the average 277K STEM vacancies per year in the US, 252K of these are bachelors, 80K are professionals with their master's degree, 20K have a PhD, and 40K are associates. What this leaves us with is 392K STEM lords available to fill 277K available positions per annum. Yet over 11 million STEM-degreed individuals currently work outside their discipline. And thus, the number of STEM-degreed workers not only vastly outnumbered the job openings available, the official numbers as given out by many companies are grossly undercounted as well. So what gives? Why is it that there is talk of a STEM shortage when we have a supply far exceeding demand? The answer is because the shortage is completely artificial. In order for workplaces to justify continuing to pay out 60 to 100K a year annual salaries, the candidates need to meet a set of qualifications for the job. However, since these high-skilled professionals are a scarce asset, at least in theory, higher wages are used to incentivize people into getting the education and criteria needed in order to fill these roles. However, when most prospects to find a good-paying job out of high school are non-existent since it's all either outsourced or automated, when many people are brought up and taught that the road to success entails getting a college degree, the long-term result is an oversaturation of degreed workers. In the face of this, to justify the scarcity of positions and above-average wages, firms are poised to arbitrarily raise qualifications as to exclude otherwise qualified individuals from the job. The result is we have a growing number of underemployed college professionals working outside their field of practice. This is how we end up with a generation of burger-flipping psychologists, Uber-driving IT specialists, and brain-surgeon Walmart greeters. In a rationally planned economy, we could take use of this surplus of skilled workers and put them to work. But since these people aren't economically viable according to the market, they get left out to dry. Leave it to capitalism to squander an entire generation of tens of millions of intelligent, well-educated, would-be productive workers. As alluded to in the last segments, there has been a paradigm shift in the nature of labor. At the onset of the Industrial Revolution, most of the population worked in agriculture. However, as society continued to modernize, as productive forces have advanced, the population shifted from agriculture to manufacturing. In capitalism, firms in competition are driven to automate as to undercut their competitors and increase cost efficiency. The result is a decreasing need for human involvement in the production process. Then, with the dismantling of Fordist Keynesianism in the 1970s, most of our manufacturing was either outsourced or continued to be automated away. Today, we now live in the service economy as a result. However, the process of cost-cutting measures doesn't stop here. It's bleeding into the service sector as well, as firms in competition are perpetually driven to reduce their operational costs and undercut competitors. The need for human labor to run civilization is only trending downward. As evidenced by a third of the workforce staying home for 2 months at the start of the pandemic, most jobs that people work in this day and age are largely unnecessary and serve no real social function.
And after that, I just sort of space out for about an hour.
Space out?
Yeah, I just stare at my desk. But it looks like I'm working. I do that for probably another hour after lunch, too. I'd say in a given week, I probably only do about 15 minutes of real, actual work.
But if the population is continuously being outmoded by automation, if wages and benefits are continuously being sliced, it means that the share of revenue belonging to workers is at a historic low. And if working class revenue keeps declining, since it's ultimately people who buy the goods, not the machines used to make the goods, then the final outcome can only be crisis, because if the working population has no source of income, then they can't purchase the goods from the firms, leading to a cascading effect which causes the economy to slow to a grinding halt. The long-term ramifications of this can only mean capitalism's inevitable demise, as capitalism is not only doomed to fail, it has in fact failed multiple times in the past throughout history. All the ruling class can do is implement counteracting tendencies to prolong its lifespan, be it war, imperialist expansion, neoliberal austerity, outsourcing, cutting wages and benefits, or planned obsolescence. Regardless of the scheme, it's never a permanent fix, and decade by decade the ruling class is driven to pursue increasingly abstract and barbaric means to restore lost profit margins. Nowadays, they're flirting with the idea of a Green New Deal or the Great Reset, a kind of hyper-centralized, neo-feudal, steady-state, rentier vampire capitalism of sorts, if you will. In David Graeber's book titled Bullshit Jobs, A Theory, he overviews in detail the long-term consequences of automation, technological unemployment, and its impact on the workforce. During the dawn of the early 20th century, at the rate which industry was advancing and expanding, at the rate that the productive forces were advancing, many economists were predicting that by the year 2000, average work weeks would be about 15 hours. And yet this is not the case. Instead, we see the proliferation of gig work, corporate bureaucracy, and low-skill service work where people are kept for 40-plus hours per week to make ends meet. Why is this? Why are work hours increasing, not decreasing, despite the phenomenon of advancing productive forces, technological unemployment, and automation? One of the reasons for this is, of course, the manifestation of the increasingly abstract means of increasing the rate of exploitation, and another reason is because it is a form of social control. What happened the last time we sent a huge chunk of our workforce home for a couple of months? What was the immediate result the microsecond people had too much time on their hands? The answer? Planet-wide uprisings and anti-racism protesting.
Coming straight from the underground. A young nigga got his bag from the ground. And not the other color, so police think they have the authority to kill a minority.
Spontaneous class consciousness had emerged because now people no longer had to spend every waking moment of their lives worrying about paying bills. For once in a long time, the contradictions and inherent cruelty of the system had been laid bare before people's very eyes. And on top of that, something else happened. People are now starting to leverage their labor power again, albeit in a very spontaneous, subconscious, decentralized, unorganized manner. For the first time in a long time, American workers are fed up with the bullshit, and so many of them are riding their unemployment as long as humanly possible and refusing to go back to work for shit pay because they're sick of the worsening conditions. Wages have been stagnating for decades, benefits are being sliced, job security is on the decline, the prices of quite literally everything are inflating with no end in sight, nearly 1 million are dead from a preventable pandemic, we endure the worst wealth gap in history, social pathology is on the rise, economic instability is only continuing to worsen, and in the face of all of this, American workers find themselves in a position where their income and class mobility are becoming increasingly downward mobile with no opportunities in sight. This is the true nature of America's labor shortage, the nature that you won't learn by watching the mainstream news. If you enjoy this content and would like to support me and my work, then please remember to rate, comment, and subscribe, and share with your neighbors on social media. If you'd like to support me in more direct material ways than that, consider donating to my Patreon, linked in the description below. Some financial compensation definitely helps keep this passion project alive. Speaking of which, shoutouts to my Patreons, names of which are on screen, your gratuity is greatly appreciated. Lastly, if you're new to the subject matter of Marxism and communism and would like to read and acquire a quality education on the subject, we are now hosting weekly readings of essential Marxist literature every Saturday at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. Please consider joining the Discord and turning out for each weekly lessons to read, interpret, and discuss theory. This is a free public service which exists purely to your benefit. Anyways, that's all I have to say for now. Thanks for listening.